The morning of Marcus' wedding began just like every family event over the past 5 years, with a phone call from my mom reminding me why I had to dress properly and avoid embarrassing the family. I was in my hotel room at the Fairmont, staring at the mustard yellow bridesmaid dress that Patricia had handpicked for me when Mom called with her last-minute instructions. "Emma, sweetheart, I know this is tough for you," she said, using that tone she'd perfected, part sympathy, part condescension. She was always so concerned about me being around Marcus' successful friends and seeing Patricia's family with all their accomplishments. "Just keep in mind that not everyone can be a doctor or lawyer." "I'll keep that in mind," I answered, zipping up the dress that made me feel like a diseased banana. "And please don't bring up your job situation unless someone directly asks. It's Marcus' special day, and we don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." My job situation. That's what they called it now. Not my career. Not my work. My situation. Like it was a medical issue that needed careful handling. The reality was I had built Anderson Global Logistics into a $4.2 billion supply chain management empire, employing over 85,000 people in 47 countries. We managed distribution for 30% of the Fortune 500, revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, and were 3 days away from closing the biggest merger in our industry's history. But to my family, I worked at a grocery store. It had started innocently enough. 7 years ago, while I was setting up my first distribution center, I worked nights at a Safeway to learn the ins and outs of food retail. I wanted to understand how products moved from suppliers to shelves, how inventory management worked at the store level, and how customer demand changed. Most executives would have learned this from spreadsheets and consultants. I did it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves from midnight to 6 a.m. When family asked about my job in those early years, I'd say I worked in food retail or supply chain logistics. Somehow, that got twisted into "Emma works at a grocery store." And once that story took root, it was impossible to correct without sounding like I was lying or delusional. The first time I tried to explain what Anderson Global did, Uncle Richard patted my shoulder and said, "That's great, honey. It's nice that you're so ambitious about your grocery store job." When I mentioned hiring my first 100 employees, Aunt Susan nodded and said, "Oh, are you managing a department now? That's wonderful progress." Eventually, I stopped trying to correct them. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted rather than face their skepticism. And honestly, I was curious to see how long they could keep up their delusion about my life. The answer was apparently forever. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been especially brutal. Patricia's family were genuine high achievers. Her father had built a successful construction company. Her brother had just sold his tech startup for $50 million. Her mother was a federal judge. They were warm, accomplished people who clearly expected Marcus' family to be just as impressive. "So Emma," Patricia's brother Jason asked during cocktails, "Marcus mentioned you work in food service. Are you planning to open your own restaurant?" Before I could respond, Marcus jumped in. "Oh no. Emma is not the entrepreneur type. She works at a grocery store. But hey, it's honest work." The silence that followed was unbearable. Jason quickly recovered, too polite to show any surprise, but I saw Patricia's parents exchange a look. They were undoubtedly wondering how a family with doctors, lawyers, and successful business owners had produced someone whose greatest accomplishment seemed to be avoiding unemployment. "Food retail is fascinating," I said simply. "The logistics alone are incredibly complex." "Of course," Patricia's father said kindly, then immediately shifted the conversation to Marcus' law practice. Later that night, I overheard Patricia's mother talking to my mom by the hotel bar. Patricia mentioned Emma might be a godmother to their children someday, she said carefully. "Oh, Emma would love that," Mom replied. "She's great with kids. Of course, she's not in a position to provide much financial support, but she's very loving." "Financial support?" "Well, she's still figuring things out professionally. We help her when we can. Family takes care of family. But your grandchildren will have plenty of successful role models without worrying about Emma's situation." After that, I left the bar and spent the rest of the evening in my room, going over acquisition reports and trying to remember why I thought attending this wedding was a good idea. The morning of the wedding brought more humiliations. While getting my hair and makeup done, the other bridesmaids, Patricia's sister and 2 college friends, were talking about their careers. One was a pediatric surgeon, another was launching her second startup, and the third was a partner at a consulting firm. And Emma works in grocery, Patricia explained when they asked about me. She's been doing that for years now. Oh, the surgeon said politely. That must be stable work. Very stable, I agreed, not bothering to mention that the stability of Anderson Global came from exclusive contracts with every major food retailer in North America. The conversation quickly moved on to vacation plans. One person's family had a house in the Hamptons. Another was planning a month-long trip to Europe. When they asked about my travel plans, I simply said I didn't have any scheduled. I didn't explain that I'd be in Singapore next week finalizing a $1.8 billion merger, followed by board meetings in. The wedding was lovely, and the opening of the factory in Bavaria was another event to remember. The ceremony was truly beautiful, with Patricia glowing in her grandmother's lace dress and Marcus clearly in high spirits. I stood by the altar, clutching the bridal bouquet, trying to focus on their happiness, despite the whispered comments from relatives about my appearance. Poor Emma. I overheard Aunt Susan say to someone behind me, "That color is so unflattering on her. Patricia should have picked something more suitable for her complexion." Another voice whispered back, "It's not the dress. It's the stress. Financial pressure can really take its toll." I kept my smile intact throughout the ceremony, even when the photographer placed me slightly behind the other bridesmaids for the formal photos. He explained it was for composition, but it was clear to everyone that it was to minimize the visual impact of the family member who didn't quite fit. The reception was hosted in the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom, a stunning venue I had once considered purchasing a couple of years ago, before realizing it wasn't ideal for my real estate portfolio. The dinner was delicious, though I barely enjoyed it, as I endured toast after toast celebrating everyone's achievements but mine. To Patricia's family, Marcus said, raising his champagne glass. To Judge Whitfield, who's dedicated her life to justice. To Jason, who sold his company for more than most of us will earn in a lifetime. To Mr. Whitfield, who built his construction empire from nothing. He then turned to our side of the room. To my family, Uncle Richard, who just made partner at his accounting firm after 20 years of hard work. To Cousin Derek, who opened his second dental practice this year. And to Dr. Patricia's maid of honor, Sarah, who's saving lives as a pediatric surgeon. His eyes met mine during the pause. And to family members who support us in their own ways. My sister Emma, who flew all the way from Seattle to be here, despite the cost. She works in food service, which is honest, necessary work, and we admire her for staying true to simpler values. The applause was polite but noticeably pointed. Several people glanced at me with the kind of sympathy usually reserved for those recovering from addiction or going through a divorce. It was during the dancing that things truly took a turn. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and overheard a conversation that would change everything. Patricia's mother was speaking to Marcus near the bar, her voice sharp with concern. "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly," she said. "Is Emma financially stable? I don't mean to pry, but Patricia mentioned she might want Emma to be godmother to your children. Given her circumstances, Emma, God knows, she's been struggling for years." Marcus chuckled. "She's sweet, but she can barely take care of herself. She's been working the same grocery store job for 7 years now. Never got promoted, never tried anything else. I think she's just not cut out for ambition, you know?" Mrs. Whitfield seemed relieved. I was worried about the influence. Not that there's anything wrong with her work, of course, but Patricia comes from a family of achievers. Her father built his company from scratch. Her brother just made $50 million on his startup. We want our grandchildren to have the right kind of role models. "Don't worry about that," Marcus said. "Emma's basically the family charity case now. Mom sends her money for rent sometimes. We all chip in for her car payments. She means well, but she's not capable of more than what she's doing now." That wasn't true. I had never asked for or received any financial help from my family, but I realized that was the story they told themselves to make sense of my deliberately modest lifestyle choices. I was about to go back inside when I heard Derek's voice from around the corner, talking to some of Patricia's relatives. "Did you see Emma's car in the parking lot?" he was saying. "It's like 15 years old." I actually felt embarrassed for her when the valet had trouble starting it. Marcus mentioned she's been using food stamps. Another voice replied, one of Patricia's cousins. "I think it's just sad." "Yeah," Derek continued. "The whole family is successful except for her. My mom thinks she might have some undiagnosed learning disability. How else can you explain someone working the same entry-level job for 7 years? At least she seems happy," the cousin said, trying to be kind. "I guess ignorance is bliss," Derek replied. "She has no idea how far behind she's fallen." I'd heard enough. I pulled out my phone and texted David, my head of security, asking for a pickup. His reply came almost instantly. 10 minutes, helicopter fueled and ready." I started heading back toward the ballroom, planning to quietly say my goodbyes and leave before things got any worse. But just as I reached the main table, Marcus tapped his champagne glass to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want to take a moment to thank everyone for being here tonight. Patricia and I are so grateful to be surrounded by such successful, accomplished people. Our families represent the best of what hard work and ambition can achieve." He gestured to the room around us. "We have entrepreneurs who've built million-dollar companies, doctors saving lives, lawyers fighting for justice, executives running large corporations, people who've taken risks, pushed boundaries, and refused to settle for anything less than excellence." His eyes met mine from across the room, and there was something almost pitying in his look. "But we also owe our thanks to family members who contribute in simpler ways. My sister, Emma, flew all the way from Seattle to be here tonight, even though I know it was likely a stretch for her budget. She works in food service, which is honest, humble work. Not everyone can be a CEO or a surgeon, and that's perfectly fine." The applause that followed was polite, but tinged with condescension. A few people glanced at me with the sort of sympathy one reserves for someone announcing a terminal illness. "Emma represents something important," Marcus continued, warming to his theme. "In a world obsessed with achievement and status, she reminds us that there's dignity in simple work and value in modest goals. She's content with her life, and that's something to admire." Patricia's father stood up, clearly in a generous mood after a few glasses of wine, and called out to Emma, thanking her for showing us that happiness doesn't need to be tied to success. The room raised their glasses to me, as if I were an inspirational poster about overcoming obstacles. I saw pity in their eyes, mixed with a sense of relief that their own children had turned out so much better. It was then that my phone buzzed. "Miss Anderson." The voice belonged to a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit, who had somehow appeared by my side without anyone noticing. David Martinez looked exactly how you'd expect someone like him to look. Former Secret Service, trained to handle threats to world leaders, now focused on protecting one of Seattle's most important executives. "I'm David Martinez, your head of security," he said, his voice projecting just enough for the nearby tables to hear. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have an urgent situation that requires your immediate attention." The conversations around us halted. David had that kind of presence, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, exuding professional alertness, wearing an expensive suit. "Security," Mrs. Whitfield repeated, looking confused. "The helicopter is waiting on the roof," David continued smoothly. "Your 9 p.m. conference call with the Singapore team can't be delayed. The Chin Industries merger closes Monday morning, and the Tokyo markets open in 3 hours. The board is waiting for your final approval on the $1.88 billion acquisition." Marcus's champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. "I'm sorry to cut this short," I said, standing and smoothing down my unflattering mustard dress. I tried to keep business separate from family time, but unfortunately, international markets don't respect wedding schedules. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Marcus grabbed my arm, his voice breaking slightly. David stepped closer, not threatening but with the kind of readiness that made it clear he was prepared for anything. "Sir, I'll need you to step back from Miss Anderson," David said firmly. "Miss Anderson?" Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. I looked around at the room full of faces, all staring at me. The same people who had spent the entire evening discussing my failures and limitations, as if I weren't even present. I suppose I should explain, I said. My name is Emma Anderson, and I'm the founder and CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. We're the largest privately held supply chain management company in North America, with operations in 47 countries, and an annual revenue of $4.2 billion. The room fell utterly silent. The grocery store job Marcus mentioned, that's how I started. I worked nights at Safeway for 3 years while building my first distribution center during the day. I wanted to understand every aspect of food retail, customer behavior, inventory management, supply chain logistics, employee dynamics. Most executives learn this from consultants and spreadsheets. I learned it by scanning barcodes and stocking shelves. Derek's face had gone completely pale. We handle distribution for about 30% of the Fortune 500. I continued. Walmart, Target, Kroger, Safeway. If you've bought groceries in the last 5 years, there's a good chance our systems got that food from farm to shelf. We revolutionized cold chain logistics for pharmaceutical companies, developed the algorithms that optimize delivery routes for Amazon's grocery division, and created the inventory management systems used by most major retailers. Mrs. Whitfield stared at me as if I'd just claimed to be from another planet. Forbes ranked me 47th on their list of richest self-made women, I said. Though I prefer to focus on the fact that Anderson Global employs over 85,000 people worldwide, and has been carbon neutral for 3 years running. Patricia was the first to find her voice. Marcus, you said she worked at a grocery store? She does. Marcus looked as though he were struggling to process simple information. She told me she worked in food service. Food retail logistics, I clarified gently. I oversee supply chain operations for every major grocery chain in North America, and am expanding operations in Europe and Asia. When I said I worked in food retail, I meant I was revolutionizing how food gets from producers to consumers. Uncle Richard stared at his bourbon, as if it might have some answers for him. The resume help I offered was very thoughtful, I said. Though my current position is working out well. David checked his watch. Ms. Anderson, we truly need to leave now. The call from Singapore is urgent. Chin Industries won't wait, and if we miss this opportunity, the merger could fall apart. That's 18,000 jobs at risk. Of course. I turned to Marcus and Patricia. Congratulations once more on your wedding. It was a beautiful ceremony, and I wish you both nothing but happiness. Wait. Marcus had grabbed my arm again, then quickly released it when David shifted his position. Emma, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? Why? Let us think. Tell you what, that I was successful. Would it have made a difference? Of course it would have made a difference. Really? Because from what I overheard tonight, it seems you were all quite comfortable with your version of who I was. The family charity case. The one needing financial assistance. The learning disabled sister who was too limited for real success. We never said you were learning disabled, Derek had protested weakly. You literally said that just 20 minutes ago on the terrace, I had responded, along with speculating about my use of food stamps, and expressing embarrassment over my car. Patricia's father had continued staring at me dumbfounded. You're really? You actually run a billion-dollar company? She asked, her voice full of disbelief. She's on the Forbes list, someone whispered from the back of the room. I turned to see one of the younger cousins holding up her phone. Emma Anderson, CEO of Anderson Global Logistics. Net worth estimated at $2.3 billion. The quiet murmur that followed spread through the room like a row of falling dominoes. This doesn't make sense, Aunt Susan had said, her tone almost accusatory. If you're so wealthy, why do you dress so simply? Why do you drive an old car? Why live like a normal person? Because money isn't the most important thing in life, I had replied. I thought family was. I believe showing up for the people you care about was worth more than flaunting your net worth. I thought humility in success was a virtue. Marcus had shaken his head. But you let us think you were struggling. I didn't let you think anything, Marcus. You assumed. All of you. You decided that because I didn't boast about my achievements at every family event, I must not have any. You constructed an entire narrative about my life, full of financial struggles I don't have and limitations I've never exhibited, without ever asking me one straightforward question about my career. But you said you worked in food retail, Patricia had argued. I said I worked in food retail logistics. When I mentioned supply chain management, you nodded politely and then changed the subject. When I talked about hiring employees, you thought I was managing a grocery store department. When I mentioned traveling for business, you assumed it was for training sessions at other locations. The room had gone completely silent, everyone processing the enormity of their assumptions. You know what's funny? I had continued. 3 years ago, when I missed Christmas, you all assumed it was because I couldn't afford the plane ticket. The reality is I was in Tokyo personally negotiating a deal that brought 2,000 manufacturing jobs back to the US. Last year, when I couldn't attend Derek's wedding, you assumed I was working extra shifts to make ends meet. Actually, I was in Germany opening our newest facility, which now employs 1,500 people. Derek looked like he might be ill. Miss Anderson, David had interrupted gently. The helicopter. I nodded. I really have to go. Singapore can't wait. There are many people relying on this deal closing successfully. As I moved towards the exit, the crowd parted around me as though I were royalty. The same people who had been looking at me with pity just moments ago were now staring at me. Their faces a mix of confusion, and what I was certain was embarrassment. At the door, I turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Marcus, I hope you and Patricia are very happy together. Marriage should be about loving someone for who they are, not for who you think they should be. Maybe that's something worth keeping in mind. The elevator ride to the roof was silent, except for the soft jazz playing through the speakers. David held the door for me as we stepped onto the hotel's helipad, where my pilot was already waiting with the rotors spinning. How was the wedding, ma'am? David asked, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. Educational, I replied, buckling my seatbelt and putting on the headset. As we took off, I saw people gathered on the hotel's lower terraces, staring up at the helicopter with visible confusion. My phone was already buzzing with calls and texts. Marcus, Derek, Aunt Susan, and some unfamiliar numbers. I turned off the phone and gazed out at the city lights below. Tomorrow, I would return to managing supply chains and board meetings, along with the countless small decisions that kept the global company running. Tonight had reminded me of why I kept these worlds separate. But perhaps it was time to stop hiding who I had become. Maybe the people who truly mattered would love me regardless, and the ones who didn't? Well, maybe their approval wasn't something worth seeking after all. Singapore, ma'am? The pilot asked through the headset. Actually, I said, let's make a quick stop at the office first. I want to change out of this dress. It's awful, and I have a feeling the Singapore meeting is going to get photographed. David smiled. Yes, ma'am. I did mention that mustard yellow wasn't your color. As the Seattle skyline grew larger ahead of us, I found myself smiling. Tomorrow, the business news would probably mention Anderson Global Logistics making an unexpected helicopter exit from a family wedding. My PR team would be dealing with the inevitable questions about any potential drama surrounding my departure. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt entirely free to be exactly who I was, successful, accomplished, and no longer willing to hide it just to make others comfortable with their assumptions. The funny thing is, I had spent so much energy trying to remain humble that I'd forgotten the difference between humility and invisibility. Maybe it was time to let the world, and my family, see what I had really built. After all, Anderson Global Logistics didn't revolutionize supply chain management by staying silent and hoping people would notice.